Now I'd like to introduce you to our main speaker, John Haxton. John is head of our thought leadership team at OPP, and as a chartered psychologist, has been working in the field of occupational psychology for about 30 years, and has been working with the MBTI tool since, when, John?
1997, which seems like a remarkably long time ago.
It does.
So, thank you, Kerry. And yes, welcome everyone to this webcast, which is really all about how some of our research using the MBTI and other tools helped us to understand a little more about the glass ceiling, why women tend to be way underrepresented at the highest levels in organizations. And we'll also be touching on how we might be able to use the MBTI to help to redress the balance. So do have a vote about poll, because I'm going to stop voting in a second. So to set the scene, as Kerry's already said, we're going to look to see how many countries have a female head of government. And the answer is just 4.9% of countries have a female head of government, just under 5% of countries in the world. And as roughly half the world's population is female, that's hardly represented. So, Kerry, if you look at the results of our poll, how do you think of the audience's accuracy in answering that question?
I'd say pretty accurate there, John. We've got 47% of you voted the 0 to 5%, and then 50% for the 6 to 10%. So actually, we were kind of getting on that cusp. A few people perhaps a little bit over-optimistic, but generally going for the lowest two options there.
I get it's good to err on the optimistic side. Of course, the situation's actually a bit better if you look at heads of state. That includes people like the Queen. That's almost double. That's 8.4%. But if you look at the people with the power, it's just 4.9%. Now, of course, most of us don't get to deal with prime ministers or presidents, but some of us do work with people in the C-suite at board level, and here the figures aren't particularly representative either. Just a quarter of directors of FTSE 100 companies are female, and if you look at executive directors, it's even more extreme, just 10%. Directorships in FTSE 250 companies are even more skewed. Here's another statistic for you, for those who like stats, from a report back in 2015. There are more CEOs of FTSE 100 companies named John than there are female CEOs. Oh, and also more CEOs called Dave or David than female CEOs. In the USA, John comes up trumps again. In Australia, it says Peter, and so on. So why is this? Well, good old-fashioned misogyny will certainly play a role. But two less obvious reasons might be the differences between men and women in how they make decisions, and differences in how confident they are in their abilities, but also how some organizations may value some approaches to make decisions more than others. And perhaps this applies to your own organization. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the opportunity to answer another question. What type of decision making does your organization prefer and reward? So please have a go at answering this now. Does your organization prefer and reward logical, objective decision making the most? Or is it values-based, people-focused decision making that gets the thumbs up? Or are both valued equally? Or perhaps you really don't know. Or possibly this question doesn't apply to you because you are perhaps a one-person organization or some other reason. Have a go and put your answers now, and we'll look at the results in just a moment. So let's look at what we already know about this area. First of all, there's a lot of evidence that women are, on the whole, more likely to make decisions on the basis of values and how those decisions affect people than men are. Those of you who use the Myers-Briggs type indicator will know that this difference in decision-making is at the heart of the thinking-feeling preference, and that in the UK population, around 2/3 of women and around 1/3 of men are likely to take this feeling approach. And the evidence here is not just from the MBTI. Many other studies have come up with a very similar result. secondly, we know that though this people-focused and values-driven approach to decisions might often be as effective or even more effective than a narrowly objective approach, organizations don't necessarily see things that way. So let's look now at how you answered that question. So, Kerry, are those results a surprise to you?
Not particularly, John. I would say that from when I've been talking to people in the past, that the one we had the most, the 50% around logical, objective decision making, that fits with my experience. So
amongst you as a group, around about half of your organizations prefer and reward objective, logical decision making most, and just 3% think that your organization prefer and reward values-based, people-focused decision making the most. And values and people and the value of people may be underplayed and seen as too fluffy, if you will, in many organizations. There's even some evidence from some research that people-focused managers are seen as less competent. So those women that are promoted might be less likely to have a feeling preference, to take a values-based approach than those who aren't. And there's some recent research that suggests that women and those with a feeling preference are promoted to be managers more slowly than men and more slowly than those with a thinking preference. Thirdly, there's some evidence that men are more likely than women to overestimate their abilities. So all things being equal, men may be more likely than women to put themselves forward for promotion or to apply for more senior roles. What's perhaps less clear is how these different factors interact, so we decided to investigate this with 2 research studies, which is the bulk of what we'll be talking about this afternoon. First of all, we looked at a large group of people who had taken the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, online, over 600,000 people. We'll be talking a little bit about the MBTI in this webcast, so we're asking you another question: how familiar are you with the MBTI? So please do have a go at answering this question in the next few minutes. Now, with this large group of 600,000 people, we did know what level people were within the organizations, so we're able to see how personality, gender, and level interacted for those people. In the second study, we looked at a much smaller group, 315 people, who had taken 2 assessments as part of selection for different jobs in a range of different organizations. They'd taken a set of ability tests, the Abilities Mental Agility Series, and a personality questionnaire, the 16PF. And we'll talk more in a little while about how this helped us to look at how confident or overconfident people were in their abilities. So let's start then with the study using the MBTI to look at how gender and the way in which we make decisions might relate to the level that we tend to reach in organizations. So in preparation for this, we ask you how familiar you were with the MBTI on a scale ranging from never heard of it to I'm qualified and consider myself an expert user. So let's look at the results of that now. So around half of you are qualified to use the MBTI, another 22% consider yourself an expert user, and just 1% of the people who voted have never heard of the MBTI. I don't know if that's what we would expect from a webcast like this, Kerry?
I'd say it's certainly what we'd hope from a webcast like this, John.
What I would say is very much thank you for those of you who have never heard of the MBTI or have only just who have never taken it, and welcome to the webcast as well as everybody else. And we will spend just a little moment saying a little bit about the MBTI so you know what we're talking about in the rest of the webcast. So if you look at the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, at its base it looks at 4 things. First of all, and I'll just go quickly through this, it looks at extroversion and introversion. Extroverts are people who focus their attention on and get their energy from the outside world of people and things. Introverts from that more inner world of thoughts and reflections. Sensing and intuition looks at the way we take in information. People with a preference for sensing, it's about the real evidence of their 5 senses. and their very clear memories, perhaps, of that evidence, realistic information, whereas for intuitives, what they prefer to look at and really trust is possibilities and the way things connect together. Thinking and feeling, we'll come back to in a moment, and judging and perceiving looks at your lifestyle, how you live your life. People with preference for judging prefer to live their lives in a very much an organized, structured, planned way. With a preference for perceiving, these people prefer to live their lives typically in a more open, spontaneous, perhaps unplanned way. Now, thinking and feeling is what we'll be looking at particularly at today. And thinking and feeling really is about the way we make decisions, the process we prefer to use to make decisions. And if we look at that in just a little bit more detail, people with a preference for thinking prefer to make decisions by stepping outside a problem and trying to look at it objectively and dispassionately from the outside and making a decision in that way. Whereas people with a preference for feeling prefer to make those decisions by stepping into the problem, to be compassionate and deal with the people and the values of the people involved in that decision. Now, in our group of 600,000 people, as a whole, there are slightly more men than women, but a bigger imbalance with regards to thinking and feeling. Almost 3/4 of the group had a preference for thinking, and just over a quarter had a preference for feeling. Now, if there was no relationship between gender and type, you might expect that about 3/4 of men would have a thinking preference and also 3/4 of women. Of course, that's not what we actually found. 85% of men in our group had a thinking preference and just 61% of women. Women were more likely than men to have a feeling preference, to prefer a values-based approach to decision-making. We also looked at occupational level. The group contained people at all levels, from employee right up to the very top of organizations. So if we look at, for example, at the top level, that's just 3% of a total group. So if there is no relationship between gender and the level people reach, if there was no bias, in other words, we'd expect 3% of men to be at the top level and also 3% of women. And if there was no TF bias, no thinking-feeling bias, we'd expect the same. 3% of those with a T preference at the top level and 3% of those with an F preference. Now, 32% of the group were at employee level, so we'd expect 32% of men, 32% of women, 32% of thinking preference, and 32% of feeling preference up at employee level. Now, of course, there could just possibly be some biases in the way in which organizations work and who actually gets to reach that top level. I don't know what you think we'll find in the figures. Let's take a look at what the data says. So we're going to look first at gender. Lots of numbers here, but if you look at the top line of that table, which is about people who reach the top level in organizations, you can see that 4% of men make it to the top level, but less than 3% of women. Of course, if there was no gender difference, we'd expect 3% of both. So women are underrepresented at the top level. If we then look at employee level, at the bottom of our table there, we might expect, if there was no bias, 32% of both. Of course, what we get is something rather different. 26% of men and 41% of women. So women are overrepresented at employee level. Underrepresented at the top level, overrepresented at employee level. If we then look at thinking and feeling, we get the same sort of effect, not quite so pronounced, but the same effect with people with feeling preference being relatively underrepresented at top level and overrepresented at bottom level. Now, of course, it might just be that all the differences here are just down to gender bias. So we did a few fancy stats. For those of you who are stats aficionados, what we did was a univariate analysis surveillance. Those of you who aren't stats aficionados, you can forget I said that. We did this to find out what was going on. We found that both gender and thinking feeling had separate effects on organizational level, though gender did have the greatest effect. There's also an interaction effect going on, though, and the way this works in practice is really quite interesting. So what we're going to do now is look at men and women separately. In the whole group, across all levels, 85% of men had a thinking preference and 15% had a feeling preference. And for men, this doesn't change very much if we look at different levels. So looking at the thinking column, it just varies from 82.5% for employees up to 86.5% for upper middle management. The total range there, just 4% between the different levels. For women, in the whole group, 61% had a thinking preference, but if we look at the different levels for women, there's actually a lot of variation. From 54% thinking at employee level up to around 70% at the top three levels. That's a range of 16%. So let's just take a moment really to summarize what this first study has told us. First of all, women were significantly more likely than men to prefer the values-driven feeling approach to making decisions. Secondly, women were significantly underrepresented at high levels in organizations and significantly overrepresented at lower levels, as were all those with a feeling preference. Thirdly, for men, the proportion of those with a feeling preference didn't vary much between levels. For women, the proportion varied from 46% at employee level down to 30% at top level. Now, this could mean that if you're a man, whether you have a thinking or a feeling preference doesn't make a lot of difference to whether you're promoted. And actually, you're more likely to be promoted full stop than if you're a man than if you're a woman. If you're a woman, it makes quite a lot of difference. You are significantly more likely to get to the top if you have a thinking preference, or, as this study is based on reported type, if you report having a thinking preference. In either event, there does seem to be some gender bias taking place here. Now, we'll come back at the end to talk about what we might be able to do about this, but first, let's go on to look at the second study. Here, we aren't using the MBTI as we're looking at a selection situation. We're using instead a group of 315 people applying for a range of different roles at a range of different levels across a range of different organizations. When I thought about saying this, I shouldn't have said different so much, but it's too late now. And these people were assessed using an online selection system called Sirius. Now, two things made this group particularly suitable for our research. First, as part of the online system, they completed an ability test, the Abilities Mental Agility Series. And one feature of this test is that after each question, the test taker is asked to rate how confident they are that they got that question right. By averaging this across all the questions in the test, we can obtain an estimate of a person's overall level of confidence. And then, by comparing this with how well they actually did on the test, their real level of ability, we can get an estimate of whether they have an accurate picture of their abilities, or whether actually they were overconfident or underconfident, what the test publishers call self-monitoring. Each candidate also completed the 16PF, a personality questionnaire. As the name suggests, this contains 16 scales, but two of these were particularly relevant for this research. The reasoning scale is in fact a short ability measure of logical reasoning and intelligence included in the personality questionnaire, and sensitivity looks at the extent to which an individual makes decisions on the basis of their values and their subjective view of the world. So there's a strong correlation with feeling in MBTI terms. If we look at confidence and reasoning, the people who are high on reasoning were on average more confident. The bars on the right-hand side of our graph are higher than the ones on the left, and that's probably what we'd expect. Where it gets interesting, though, is where we compare self-monitoring, how underconfident or overconfident people were, with reasoning. The people who scored low on reasoning on the left-hand side of that new graph were on average the highest on self-monitoring. In other words, the less able you are in terms of reasoning ability, the more overconfident you the more overconfident you are. And this is an example of something which is often called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The less skilled you are at something, the more likely you are to overestimate how good you are at it. Let's see how gender fits into this picture. First of all, it's important to state that there is no actual difference in ability between men and women. Neither group was higher than the other in terms of their score and reasoning. But men were more confident in their abilities than women, and also more overconfident. And this applies to every level of reasoning ability. So looking at the left-hand side chart, men of low ability were actually just as confident that they had done well as women of high ability. And looking at the right-hand chart, the most overconfident group, the group with the most inflated view of their own skills, were low ability men. We're going to look now at sensitivity, which is a 16PF scale, a little similar to MBTI thinking feeling. People who are high in sensitivity tend to make decisions on the basis of their values and a more subjective view of the world. Here, the data suggests that people with a high score in sensitivity are less confident in their abilities and less overconfident. It's the people who believe that they make decisions on the basis of objective logic who are the most confident and the most overconfident. And if we bring gender into the picture, women are, on average, significantly higher on sensitivity than men. They're more likely to make values-based decisions, as you might expect from the MBTI results and lots of other research. But if we look at confidence, men are more confident and more overconfident than women for every level of sensitivity. On the left, high sensitivity men are just as confident as low sensitivity women. Combining this with the reasoning data, it looks as if the most overconfident group are men with a low reasoning score who believe that they make objective as opposed to value-based decisions. And there's all sorts of places where we could go about finding, especially in the light of what's happening in the wider world. But I'm going to stay away from politics, and we're going to move on to the next slide. What then can we learn from these two studies? Well, this research confirms that women are more likely than men to make values-based decisions, but we know that many organizations, including the organizations that about half of you work for, may see this approach as less valuable than a more narrowly objective, and I use that word advisedly, approach. And at least in part because of this, women are less likely to reach high levels in organizations, and those who do are less likely than other women to have, or at least report having, a feeling preference, to use and demonstrate the values-based, people-focused approach to making decisions. And if women are, on average, less confident of their abilities than men, which is what the second study suggests, then this is just going to make things even worse. It may be, for example, that for a man and a woman of equal ability, the man with more confidence in his abilities might apply for a job or promotion where the woman might not. So this is all sounding rather gloomy, rather downbeat, but is there anything that we can actually do about it? I think perhaps there's actually quite a lot that we can do. For a start, we can help individuals to see that including a consideration of people and values in their decisions just could be a useful and valid thing to do. For example, many of you who already use the MBTI may be familiar with the zigzag model of decision making. But for those of you who aren't, what this suggests is that in making a decision, it's useful first of all to look at the real-world data, the concrete realistic data, the evidence of your five senses, but not to forget to also look at what the intuitive side may cover: possibilities, connections, future focus. Then, having collected that data, to take that into making a decision, looking both at the thinking approach, logically weighing up the pros and cons to look at what the objective answer might be, but not to forget considering the values of yourself and the organization and the people, and the effect that decision might have on people. And one of the attachments we put to this webcast is some information about things like a pocket problem solver that you can use to help you make those sorts of decisions. And of course, we could use the same sort of approach to help teams see the importance of using feeling in decision making. And again, we've added some links to the attachment to this webcast to help you to see how you might do this. Moving us up to the level of your organization is difficult, but not impossible, especially if there's ongoing support. And again, we've attached a link to a case study about our work with Macmillan Cancer Support as an example. Of course, a big part of all of this is self-awareness, being aware of how you do things, and that it might be different for other people, and that you aren't necessarily always right. And finally, I suppose, when organizations select people, we do know that there are all sorts of biases operate, and that indeed might be a topic for another webcast on another day. But one thing that this research does make us aware of is that confidence reality gap. If we know that men are more overconfident in their abilities than women are, well, perhaps just having that knowledge will be useful for a woman thinking but holding back from applying for promotion for a new job. And for those who are working as coaches, perhaps that's a useful piece of information to share with your clients.
Okay, thanks, John, for that interesting webcast. We do now have a few questions for you. The first one of which is, do women change their preference to feeling, change their feeling preference to a thinking preference as they rise through an organization?
That's a really interesting question. Of course, what the MBTI theory suggests is that you don't actually change your preference because that preference perhaps is inbuilt, and that's really a part of you. Certainly, it's going to be likely that women, or indeed many people will need to change their behavior as they rise through an organization. And as we've seen from this presentation and from the answers of people who are taking part in those polls, because organizations may not reward that feelings approach, may change their behavior, and as a result, their reporter type may change from feeling to thinking. I suggest, though, it's not the underlying person who changes, it's what their reporter type is and perhaps what the behavior is. Really, I suppose, with the MBTI, what this can help us to do is to see who we really are so that we can find the best and most adaptive way to adapt our behavior to situations rather than having a different version of ourselves from who we really are.
Excellent. Thank you, John. We're actually almost out of time, so thank you very much. For all of you listening, please do rate how you found this webcast and do tell us what you think. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.